Hello, fifth grade. It's Tuesday, the 12th of, I have my date right, of May, and it's time for history. So we had a great time in Zoom. We were able to do history during Zoom time yesterday, and so I'm looking forward to continuing today between the world wars on page 209. So it says, the Roaring Twenties. By the beginning of 1920, most Americans turned their thoughts to happier times. Factories stopped making war supplies and began making products that would change the style of living in America. In a few years, a housewife would not have to scrub her clothes on a washboard anymore. She could buy a washing machine. Later, families could buy toasters, vacuum cleaners, and refrigerators to make their lives a little easier. The invention of the radio brought another change to American life. In the evenings, many families sat around their radios listening to beautiful music, exciting programs, speeches by the president and other leaders, and the latest news, even while the news event was happening. As great preachers spread the message of salvation over the airwaves, the gospel reached people who could not or would not go to church. Everyone had to listen quietly because the first radios made a crackling sound that sometimes made it difficult to hear the program. So we see a picture here of a family sitting in front of the radio, and it says, listeners had to strain their ears to hear the weak signals from the early radios. Loud static also made listening difficult. But still it was great because they could hear the president for the first time. They could hear radio programs. They had like fun programs, stories that people would read, music, world events, etc. So the radio was a big deal in other inventions, washing machines, toasters, etc. In 1925, Calvin Coolidge became the first president to give his inaugural address over the radio, meaning his opening speech for his presidency. Families gathered around the radio heard the new president talk about America's history and America's future. Because of what America is and what America has done, President Coolidge said, a firmer courage, a higher hope, aspires the heart of all humanity. Then he gave Americans a challenge to learn from their history. We cannot continue these brilliant successes in the future, he said, unless we continue to learn from the past. In the 1920s, many Americans could afford to own an automobile because of the lower prices made possible by Henry Ford's assembly lines. We talked about that. Families began to go for Sunday afternoon drives and found it easier to visit grandparents and other relatives who lived in different parts of the country. Special highways built for automobile traffic amazed people. How surprised they would have been if they could have looked ahead to see modern highways filled with millions of cars in every size, shape, and color. Business thrived as factories made many different products. Workers were hired to make even more products. For many Americans, the Roaring Twenties, quote unquote, was a prosperous decade. Okay, just the word roaring, the word roaring is a positive word about everything that's going on. So the automobile, we have all these inventions. We have people coming from all over the world for freedom and opportunities. It's a really great time. President Coolidge was able to give his address over the radio, and people could hear his words about his hopes for America and his desires. And so this is the mid-1920s, and things are just humming along, buzzing along. Especially like the car really changed our lives. We know Henry Ford's assembly line make the cars cheaper. They came out faster. And it made a huge difference in our lives. And my mom, and one thing they talked about was families could go on Sunday drives. And my mom, who was born in 1933, she remembers going on Sundays on family drives with all her brothers and sisters and her parents. And they just go drive and have a picnic somewhere out, on the grass somewhere. And she remembers that very vividly, going for Sunday drives. Okay, but then unfortunately, look at our next title. It says up here is the Great Depression. So we go from a roaring time to the Great Depression. In 1929, hard times came to America. Banks ran out of money. People did not have money to buy things. Factories closed down. Many people lost their jobs. As weeks turned into months, people began to go hungry. Even though prices had dropped very low, Many people still could not afford to buy food, clothing, or factory goods. Some families lost their homes because they could not pay their bills. These difficult years from 1929 to 1940 became known as the Great Depression. Although millions of United States citizens suffered, their spirits were good, and families and individuals worked together to make the best of what they had. Many people who went through these years remember times when all else seemed to fail and God helped in special ways. Our government, under Franklin Roosevelt, worked to end the Great Depression by creating jobs such as building highways, dams, and bridges. Men who worked on these projects were paid by the government, but the government was just as poor as everyone else. Where did the money come from to pay these men? In a risky move, the government began to print and spend more money than it had. If you were to go into a store and try to spend more money than you had, you'd eventually get into trouble. The government got into trouble. Printing too much money was causing the value of the dollar to go down. Though the government helped people temporarily during the Depression, some of the policies caused serious problems that are still with us today. Okay, so I want to unpack that for you. I want to talk to you a little bit about that. So, 1929, the end of the decade, people lost their jobs and they did not have money to buy things because the banks ran out of money. They ran out of the paper money. And we know that what backs up a dollar bill is gold, okay? Gold in Fort Knox. So we have things that give the paper value. It's just a piece of paper. If it's got a 5 on it, it's a $5 bill. If it's got a 10, it's a $10 bill. But there's something that backs that money up that gives it value. And we know that that's gold. It's a kind of a, it's probably not complicated for somebody that knows a lot about economics. But it's kind of a hard concept to explain. And so the best way I could put it is our dollar is given value. It's backed up by something. And so they started to just print more money and give it out, but there was nothing to back it up. So it became less valuable. So let's say a dollar then was more like 50 cents, meaning you had to, something that would cost $1 would now cost $2, because $1, its value has gone down to like 50 cents. So you need $2 to make $1. Okay, so that's kind of the best way to explain it. So the value of $1 would go down, so you'd have to pay more for something. It would cost more dollars because they're not worth as much as they used to be. The 1 on the dollar bill, the number 1, that didn't change. The dollar didn't look differently, but what backed it up was less than what backed it up before. And so it took more money to buy things. Okay, so I'm sorry, that's the best way I can explain it. Like I said, it's complicated. And so people lost their jobs. Millionaires were not millionaires anymore. And one of the things that happened is that people would go to the bank to get loans. They'd go to borrow money with a promise that they would pay it back. So let's say that I go to the bank to get a loan. I need a loan to start a business. And so I go and I get a loan and I promise them I'm going to pay you back $20. Let's say every month I'm going to pay you $20. You give me $1,000. I'm going to pay you $20 back every month. And that's my promise. But then during this time, nobody could buy whatever I'm selling in my business. Nobody could buy it because they didn't have money. So if they don't buy it, I'm not making money. If I'm not making money, I can't pay the bank back. Okay, I'm going to say that again. I borrow $1,000. I promise the bank I'm going to give you $20 every single week. Okay? Or every single month, I'm going to pay you back $20. I set up my business. My business is to sell something, but nobody can come into my store to buy it because nobody's got money right now. It's like the whole world, it's like the whole country went broke. And then we're trying to fix it by let's just print more money. But if there's nothing to give that money value, if there's nothing to give that money make it worth anything, then it's just a piece of paper. And so nobody comes into my store because nobody has any money. And therefore, I'm not making any money, so I can't pay the bank back. Now let's say that Johnny goes to the bank. He has $1 million in the bank. He has $500,000 in the bank. He has $5 in the bank, whatever he has. He goes to get it, but the bank has given so many people loans because everybody needs money right now. Everybody's broke right now. And they promise to pay it back, but nobody can pay it back because nobody's making money. And so I go, let's say Johnny comes and he comes to get money out of the bank that he earned. He's not getting a loan. It's money that he earned. He goes and he asks for money from the bank, but the bank literally doesn't have it because it gave some to me and it gave some to all these different people with the promise that we would pay it back. But now Johnny comes to get money that was his in his bank account, but they gave that money to you and I, to others, with the promise that we would pay it back. So when Johnny came in, that money would be there, but we can't pay it back. So now Johnny has to find out, hey, we don't have your money anymore. We loaned it out with the promise that the people would pay it back. The people couldn't make any money. Everybody's broke right now. So we don't have your money, which is yours, not money that you want to be loaned to you, but money that is yours. We don't have it anymore. So you could see how horrific that would be. So let's say Johnny is a millionaire and all of his money is gone forever. And people got really, 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 really traumatized by that. Obviously, some people took their own lives because they were very wealthy and then they were broke in a heartbeat. People got sick from it. People got stressed from it. People lost their minds. A lot of stuff went on during that time. And so we lost, it says millions, and this was known from 1929 to 1940, it was known as the Great Depression. Depression in our hearts, in our heads, in our spirits, in our economy, meaning the money that America made. Millions of Americans suffered, it said, but people stuck together. People held on to Jesus. People helped each other. If you look at the picture on the page on the left, that is it was called the bread line. And there were places where businessmen who lost all of their money, women and children, could go for food. So missions rose up, the Salvation rose up, Army rose up during that time. And they took care of people, they fed people. Churches fed people. We helped each other as much as we can because people that were once very wealthy didn't have anything. Okay, and so it says that individuals worked together. Some people's spirits were good. And my dad was a child in the Great Depression, and my mom was born in 1933, and it started in 1929. And she remembers, I told you this, where they had ration books, and you'd go to the store, and they could only give you a certain amount of food per family member. And so, because there were just shortages of everything, and so my mom remembers that she would only get a certain amount of food when they go to the store that was just hers. And you could only buy, it's like now with the toilet paper, you can only buy like one package, okay? Because so many people, they were just running out of everything. And so everything had to be rationed. I have my mom's ration book somewhere. I should find that and show you. So my mom remembers that, and my dad, obviously, very poor, hungry, didn't have money for shoes necessarily. And, I told you when my mom also was younger, they couldn't afford a blanket to sleep in and a coat. So they would buy the kids a coat, and they slept in their coats, okay, because that's all they had. And so it was a very difficult time. And we're still suffering from it in some ways. And so the president created jobs for people to go back to work and to make money to try to get ourselves out of that. But some of that caused us to get into deeper trouble because we went into more debt because the government didn't have money to pay these people either. So they started to print money, but that's just a piece of paper if there's nothing to give it value, nothing to back it up. So it was a very difficult time. Let's turn the page. It says, sometimes it seemed as though the Great Depression, I'm on page 211, would never end. By the late 1930s, however, things had begun to improve. Men found jobs and earned money to buy food, clothes, and other products. However, only when America went to war again did the last traces of the Great Depression disappear. We're getting ready to go to war in 1941. Plans for peace that failed. Peace-loving countries remembered World War I with horror. the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan decided on a plan to reduce or cut back the number of weapons and the size of the armed forces that a country has. So they started, let's stop making weapons. Let's decrease the weapons. Let's not, because could be an act of aggression if you're building up weapons. We know that Germany did that in World War II. We talked about that yesterday. And so let's reduce our weapons. Everybody stop making weapons, because that's a sign of aggression. So it says, decided on a plan to reduce or cut back the number of weapons and the size of the armed forces, the soldiers, that a country has. They agreed not to build any new battleships for 10 years. After the 10 years were over, many countries began to build up their armed forces again. The United States concentrated on being strong enough to defend our country if the need arose. Japan built a huge navy capable of invading her neighbors. Germany also made her army, navy, and air force very strong. So after the 10 years were over, countries began to build up. So after World War I, we thought, let's stop building weapons. Let's not show any aggression. Let's cut back. Let's cut our soldiers, meaning not have as many soldiers. Let's cut back on our soldiers. But let's do that for 10 years, no new battleships. But then after that, countries started to build up again their armies to defend themselves, or we're going to find out, to aggressively attack again. And that's World War. So World War II is on its way, unfortunately. So for your comp check for 17B, it says number 1, what are the years of the 1920s called? Number 2, what did the government do to try to end the Depression? Number 3, why was Calvin Coolidge's inaugural address so special? Okay, and so we've talked about that in what we've read. So again, we've read 209 to 211, and so do a good job on your comp check, and we will get started on setting up for World War II, unfortunately, on Wednesday. Hopefully, we'll have enough time in Zoom to do that. If not, it will be on YouTube. Do a good job.